You have probably spent more hours than you can count trying to have a real conversation with a narcissist. A real one. Not a debate. Not a performance. Not a session where you carefully present your case while they wait for you to finish so they can dismantle it. An actual conversation, where both people speak honestly, where both people listen, where something true gets exchanged between two people who are genuinely present with each other. And if you've tried this, you already know what happens. The conversation never quite arrives. Something always intervenes. Something always redirects. Something always converts what should have been a dialogue into something else entirely. A lecture, a deflection, an ambush, a fog. Some believe that narcissists avoid real conversation because they don't care about what you have to say. Others think it's pure arrogance, that they consider themselves too superior to genuinely engage. But none of that is true. None of that captures what is actually happening underneath the surface. 94% of people who've been in long-term relationships with narcissists report never having felt truly heard in the entire duration of the relationship. Not because the narcissist was too busy. Not because they were distracted. But because of something far more specific and far more significant that lives at the very core of who they are. What I'm about to show you will reframe every conversation you've ever tried to have, and every one you've given up on having. Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about why narcissists are genuinely, deeply, sometimes desperately terrified of having a real conversation with anyone. Not just with you. With anyone. And I need you to understand this before we begin. Once you see this clearly, you will never again exhaust yourself trying to reach someone who was never able to be reached in the way you needed. The clearer you become about why the conversation was impossible, the faster you can stop blaming yourself for its failure. Let's start with the first reason, and it is the most foundational of everything that follows. A real conversation requires a real self. And the narcissist does not have reliable access to one. I know that sounds extreme. But here is the psychological reality underneath it. The narcissist's sense of identity is not internally generated the way a healthy person's is. It is externally sourced, constructed from other people's reactions, maintained by admiration, dependent on the impressions they manage to create. The self that shows up in conversation is always, to some degree, a performance, a version of a self assembled in real time from whatever the audience seems to require. And you cannot have a genuine exchange with a performance. You can only watch it. Think of it like trying to have a deep, honest conversation with a hologram. The image is convincing. The detail is impressive. It responds when you speak to it, moves when you gesture toward it. But when you reach out to make real contact, when you try to say something that requires a genuine response from a genuine interior, your hand passes through. There is nothing solid there to meet you. The narcissist in conversation is not withholding their real self as a strategy. In most cases, they are doing something more profound and more sad than that. They are generating a version of a self in real time, as fast as they can, from the available materials. And that generated self cannot do what a real conversation requires, remain still long enough to be truly known. A real scenario. You sit down with the intention of having an honest conversation about something that has been affecting you. You choose your words carefully. You come with an open heart. And within minutes the conversation has shifted away from anything you said and towards something about them, their perspective, their grievances, their version of the situation. Not because they consciously redirected it. Because the internal machinery that would allow them to receive what you're saying and respond from a genuine place is not reliably available. The conversation goes where their self-protection mechanism takes it. And their self-protection mechanism always takes it away from genuine exposure. Number 2, real conversation requires the willingness to be wrong. And for a narcissist, being wrong is not simply uncomfortable. It is existentially threatening. To understand why, you have to understand what the narcissistic ego is actually protecting. It is not protecting pride in the ordinary sense. It is protecting a fragile, unstable, entirely externally dependent sense of self from the one experience that could collapse it entirely, the experience of being genuinely seen as flawed. Because if they are flawed, truly, incontestably, undeniably flawed in a way that cannot be explained or redirected or minimized, then the story they tell about themselves, the story on which their entire psychological stability depends, is in danger. And a psyche organized around the protection of a story will do anything to keep that story intact. Picture a house of cards built on a drafty table. Every single card is essential. Remove one and the whole structure becomes precarious. Being wrong, genuinely, accountably wrong, is a card that the narcissist cannot afford to remove. So every conversation that moves toward a moment where they might have to say, I was wrong about this, I did this was not okay, every conversation that moves toward that moment gets intercepted, gets redirected, gets turned back before it arrives. Not because they planned it, but because the house of cards is always watching for drafts, and the draft of genuine accountability is the one it was specifically built to avoid. Here's what this looks like when you're living it. You bring up something specific, an incident, a behavior, a pattern you've noticed. You're careful not to be accusatory. You use the softest possible language. And yet within 30 seconds of beginning, the conversation is no longer about what you raised. It's about something you did 6 months ago, or about your tone right now, or about the fact that you always bring things up at the wrong time. Every road you try to take toward the moment of genuine accountability gets rerouted. And you come away feeling like you were somehow the one who failed to have the conversation. You didn't fail. The route was closed before you started driving. Truth number 3, real conversation requires genuine curiosity about another person. And narcissists are not, at the fundamental psychological level, genuinely curious about other people. This is not simply selfishness. This is a structural feature of how their psychology operates. Other people in the narcissist's internal world are not independent subjects with their own rich inner lives worthy of genuine exploration. They are objects in relation to the narcissist's experience, sources of supply, potential threats, audiences, mirrors. Even the people they claim to love deeply are loved in relation to what they provide, what they reflect, what they confirm. And genuine curiosity, the kind that asks a question and then actually listens to the answer without already planning its response, requires seeing the other person as real in a way that their psychology simply does not generate. Imagine trying to read a book that you're also constantly writing. Your hand is always on the page. You're adding sentences before the current sentence is finished. The story you're trying to read keeps getting overwritten by the story you're generating. That is what conversation is for a narcissist. They are not actually reading you. They are writing their own text over yours, in real time, too fast for either of you to see the original. What looks like engagement is actually a form of overwriting. What sounds like listening is actually the period between their sentences when they're formulating the next one. And what you experience, the specific, exhausting, demoralizing experience of speaking to someone and feeling completely unseen, is the accurate perception of someone who is being overwritten rather than read. The day-to-day of this is specific. You share something personal, something real, something that cost you something to say. And their response, however long it is, leaves you with the distinct feeling that they did not actually hear what you said. That the words you spoke landed in a room they were already occupying with their own thoughts and their own narrative and their own agenda, and your words merely interrupted rather than reached. That feeling is not your imagination. It is accurate reporting from a nervous system that knows the difference between being heard and being processed. And that brings us to number 4. Real conversation involves genuine vulnerability, and vulnerability is the narcissist's most feared experience. Not the performed vulnerability they sometimes deploy, the calculated disclosure of something personal, timed to produce a specific emotional response in you, designed to create the feeling of closeness while revealing nothing that could actually be used against them. That kind they can access. But the real kind, the uncontrolled, unplanned, unmanaged experience of actually not knowing how the other person will respond to something true you've said, that is something their entire psychological structure was built to prevent. Think of it like a castle with a moat, drawbridge, walls, and guards at every entrance. The castle looks inhabited. Smoke comes from the chimneys. You can hear movement inside. But the drawbridge never comes down completely. Not all the way. There is always a last threshold that is never crossed, a last door that stays closed, a last room you never quite reach. And the sadness of this, The specific, quiet, profound sadness of it is that the person inside the castle has also never been visited. They have also never experienced the full arrival of another person. They are both the guard and the prisoner. And the conversation they are terrified of having is the one that would finally open the door from the inside. A real scenario. You are having what feels like a meaningful moment. They seem more open than usual. They're sharing something that feels genuine. And then, just as it seems like the conversation is moving toward something real, something that would require them to actually be present and exposed and accountable, something shifts. The mood changes. They say something that subtly redirects. They become busy. They find something to be offended by. The moment closes. And you are left holding the feeling of something that was almost real, like a window that opened briefly and then shut before you could see what was on the other side. Number 5. Real conversation requires the ability to hold space for emotions that are not their own. And this is something a narcissist system is fundamentally not calibrated to do. When you bring your genuine feelings to a conversation, your hurt, your fear, your grief, your confusion, those feelings require something specific from the person across from you. The ability to hold them, to sit with them, to feel something about them that is oriented toward you rather than toward themselves. And in a narcissist, your emotions do not land as something to be held. They land as information about the supply dynamic. Your hurt is either something that confirms their power or something that threatens their image. Your fear is either something to be exploited or something to be managed. Your grief is either proof of their indispensability or an inconvenient complication. Think of a bucket with a hole in the bottom. You keep pouring water into it, carefully, tenderly, trusting that the vessel will hold what you're offering. And the water keeps disappearing. Not because the bucket is deliberately letting it out, but because the bucket was never made to hold water in the first place. The hole is not a choice. It is a structural feature. Your emotions were not received by them as emotions. They were processed as data. And the exhaustion you feel after trying to have an emotional conversation with a narcissist is the exhaustion of someone who kept pouring into something that was never built to hold. The specific moment of this. You are crying. Or you are expressing fear. Or you are telling them something that makes you feel genuinely vulnerable. And instead of the conversation deepening around your feeling, instead of a moment of genuine mutual presence, something happens that feels like a pivot. The conversation becomes about their feelings about your feelings. Or about what they've done for you. Or about how your feelings are making things harder for them. Your emotion, instead of being received, has been converted. Into data. Into supply. Into something they can use. And you walk away from the conversation more alone than when you entered it. Truth number 6. Real conversation threatens the narcissist's control of the narrative. A narcissist's safety, not just emotional safety but psychological survival safety, depends on being the one who defines what is real. Who determines what happened, who is responsible, what things mean. This is not negotiable for them. The moment a conversation moves into territory where both people are equally authorized to define reality, where your account of what happened carries the same weight as theirs, where your interpretation of events is as valid as their interpretation, their entire system goes on alert. Because a conversation in which they do not control the narrative is a conversation in which truth could arrive uninvited. And uninvited truth is the specific thing they have organized their entire relational life to prevent. Imagine a director who is used to controlling every aspect of the production. The script, the casting, the lighting, the editing, the final cut. And then someone hands a camera to another person in the room and says, "Film whatever you see." That is what a real conversation is for a narcissist. Uncontrolled footage. No ability to decide what gets kept and what gets cut. No ability to frame the shot in the most favorable light. Just raw, unedited reality being observed and recorded by someone they cannot manage. The panic this produces is not performance. It is the genuine terror of someone who has never been able to afford the unedited version of themselves. Here's what this looks like. You try to establish a shared understanding of a specific event. You say what you remember, what you observed, what you felt. And instead of engaging with the content of what you've said, instead of comparing recollections and working towards something that is mutually recognized as true, they contest the entire premise. Your memory is wrong. Your interpretation is biased. Your feelings are disproportionate. The conversation about the event becomes a conversation about your credibility as a witness to the event. And when the witness has been discredited, the event can be reframed. The narrative remains theirs. And you come away not just unheard, but somehow convinced, at least temporarily, that your account was never reliable to begin with. Number 7. Real conversation requires the ability to apologize. Not the performances of remorse that narcissists can produce when strategically necessary, the carefully timed, "I'm sorry you feel that way," or the tearful admission that arrives when losing you seems more costly than the discomfort of the gesture. Those they can access. But a genuine apology, one that says, "I did this specific thing, it caused you this specific harm, and I am accountable for it," without qualification and without redirection, that kind of apology requires the integration of shame that a narcissist structure cannot perform. Because genuine accountability requires holding yourself as the cause of someone else's pain. And holding yourself that way, for someone whose ego requires constant external confirmation to sustain itself, is not uncomfortable. It is devastating. Picture someone trying to pick up a live wire with their bare hands. They know the wire is there. They can see the light it generates. But every time they reach for it, the current is too much. The system recoils. Not out of cowardice exactly, but out of the specific self-protective reflex of a nervous system that has learned that certain kinds of contact produce pain it cannot integrate. Genuine accountability is that live wire for a narcissist. Every time the conversation moves toward the moment of honest apology, the system recoils, redirects, escalates, minimizes. Anything but the direct contact with the truth of what was done and the full weight of what it cost you. The day-to-day version. You've raised something that hurt you. Something specific. Something undeniable. And they respond with something that sounds, at first, like an acknowledgement. "I'm sorry you felt that way. I never meant for you to feel like that. Maybe I could have handled that better." Each of these is the shape of accountability without the substance of it. And you can feel the difference. You've always been able to feel the difference, even when you couldn't articulate why those words left you feeling worse than no apology at all. Because an apology that doesn't include the person apologizing is not an apology. It is a deflection wearing an apology's clothes. And number 8, the last reason, and the one that holds all the others together. Real conversation requires the acceptance of change. The acceptance that what comes out of a genuine exchange might alter something, might shift a position, might update an understanding, might produce a version of the relationship that is different from the version that existed before. And for a narcissist, change is not just uncomfortable. It is a threat to the entire constructed world that keeps them functional. Because the constructed world is specific. It has a specific cast of characters in specific roles. It has a specific narrative about each of them. It has a specific version of history and a specific interpretation of the present. And a real conversation could change any of these things, could introduce new information, could shift a characterization, could reveal something that requires the reconstruction of a story that has been load-bearing. Think of a mosaic made from thousands of carefully placed tiles. Each tile is a specific belief, a specific story, a specific version of a person or event. The mosaic is elaborate and convincing from a distance. But it is also fragile. Remove one tile and you don't just lose that tile. You create a gap through which the pattern becomes visible as a pattern rather than a picture. A real conversation is the risk of a tile being removed, of the gap appearing, of the constructed picture being revealed as a construction. And a narcissist who senses a real conversation approaching senses, at some level, a hand reaching for a tile. And the protection of the mosaic is not a choice they make. It is an automatic, total, fully deployed reflex that converts the approaching conversation into something else before the tile can be touched. The final real scenario. You approach with the genuine intention of something new between you, of a conversation that actually changes things. And what you encounter is not hostility, not coldness, not even obvious deflection. What you encounter is a conversation that moves and moves and moves, touches many things, covers much ground, produces much sound, and changes nothing. Arrives nowhere. Leaves everything exactly as it was when you began. And you walk away not understanding exactly what happened. The conversation took place. Words were exchanged. Something occurred. And yet, nothing moved. That nothing moved quality is the most complete description of what a conversation with a narcissist actually is. You can have the exchange. You cannot have the arrival. Now I want to say something directly to you, because this is the part of the video where the most important thing needs to be said. If you have spent years trying to have the real conversation, if you have rehearsed it, approached it from different angles, tried different words, different tones, different moments, different levels of vulnerability and directness and softness, if you have genuinely, repeatedly, with everything you had tried to reach someone through genuine conversation and been met with performance and deflection and fog, I need you to hear this. That failure was not yours. You were not communicating wrong. You were not choosing the wrong words. You were not approaching it incorrectly. You were attempting something that was structurally impossible. And the person who attempts the impossible and fails is not failing. They are encountering the limits of the possible. You deserved the real conversation. You deserved someone who could be present, who could receive what you said, who could be changed by it, who could show up in the space between your words and theirs with something genuine rather than something managed. That you did not receive that is not evidence of your inadequacy as a communicator. It is evidence of what was not available in that relationship. And what was not available, the genuine presence, the real curiosity, the willingness to be known and to know, those things are available elsewhere. With people who have done the work of building an actual interior life. With people who can be in a conversation without needing to control its outcome. With people who can hear something true and let it land and change them. Those people exist. And you, with everything you've learned about what genuine conversation requires, are now extraordinarily well-equipped to recognize them. Look back at all 8 reasons we covered today. The missing real self. The terror of being wrong. The absence of genuine curiosity. The incapacity for real vulnerability. The inability to hold emotions that are not their own. The need to control the narrative. The impossibility of genuine apology. The refusal of change. Every single one of these is a different expression of the same core wound. The profound, defended, sometimes lifelong inability to simply be a real person in the presence of another real person, without management, without performance, without the protection of constructed versions of both themselves and reality. That inability was never about you. It was about the space inside them where a genuine self was supposed to be, the space that was never safely developed, and that has been behind every conversation that was supposed to happen and never quite did. Before I go, I want to ask you this. What is the one conversation you kept trying to have that never arrived? The one that you went back to again and again, hoping that this time it would actually be real? What were you trying to say that you never felt received? Leave it in the comments. Not because I have an answer that changes what happened, but because naming it, saying the thing that was never genuinely heard, is sometimes the beginning of the conversation finally happening. With yourself. If this video helped you understand something you've been living with for a long time, share it with someone who is still trying to figure out why the real conversation keeps not happening. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is where that understanding lives. Until then, let the healing begin.